for Saturation, the exhibition Saturation, presenting 3 works. There's R+G+B, Subtracting Color, and then Perspection, which you see behind me. Perspection was developed over the course of several residency periods. And the project is a collaboration with Pierce Warnecke, an American artist who's now living in Valencia, Spain. And we came together and collaborated on this piece as a way to continue to explore ideas around embodied perception and ideas that, and what that means and what that kind of entails is that you see and hear and experience not just with your eyes and ears, but with your whole body. You sort of have to move around the space. You have to really engage with the space to fully experience it. I think so often in media art in general, you come, you sit in front of a screen, you sort of consume it, you kind of enter in the screen. It's kind of, you know, the Plato's cave sort of thing, but we're trying to make media installations that kind of reach beyond this sort of idea of looking at a screen and being kind of transported somewhere else, and instead try to ground the viewer in the space. And hopefully what that does is then they start to think about this idea of perception, and that's kind of why we titled it as it is. It's sort of perspective, a play with perspective, but it's about perception. So, but you know, hopefully after experiencing this work, they, you know, viewers go outside and they think about the way that they experience the world, the way that perspective actually does work in the world, and that's kind of, you know, what we hope to do. On a technical level, you know, Perspection is quite a complex piece, actually. It takes several computers. There's a 3D tracking sensor to understand exactly where the viewer's eyes are so that we can then modify the material that's on the screen so that essentially this odd-shaped screen disappears from view and becomes a kind of a different plane, and it reacts to your particular point of perception. And again, so it is kind of playing with this. So what exists is there's a virtual model of this room, and then everything is built around that. And so I kind of know where everybody is in the space, and we can modify things. On a sort of more macro level, the way that the piece works and what we explore with it is this sort of ideas of kind of multi-stable imagery, which has no real kind of 3D perspective. It's only the way that we understand images on a screen that allows you to imagine that it might be 3D, but it's not. So we play with these things that are flat and 3D, as well as using particular audio illusions. So there's a visual illusion of 3D space and an audio illusion of 3D space. Perspection is an interactive piece, but it's maybe not the classical way that you might imagine interactive sort of site-specific work. So the piece is built different each time, the shape of the screens. Sometimes the screens are separate, sometimes they look like this, so we've done it in multiple different orientations. And the only interaction really is so that this point of perception moves. Oftentimes you see interactive work that, you know, will draw something on your body, or, you know, by you waving your arms, you create action on the screen, which is again this kind of maybe something that we're not necessarily interested in, this kind of human to computer interface. We're really trying to look at the interface of the human to the real world. And that's kind of like, that's the biggest separation point, I think, between our work here and maybe this traditional kind of interactive media artwork, you know, is this idea that, and even VR work sort of does this, that you sort of remove the person out of real space and transmit them into either cinematic space or some virtual world, and you have things flying around their head, or really like kind of this sort of gamification kind of interaction. And we intentionally keep the interactive part. In fact, sometimes it's so subtle that people don't necessarily notice it, but it's we're okay with that because it's a piece that requires a particular amount of attention to sort of, it's like a more, I would say it's more like a painting or sculpture or a piece of installation art, more than kind of media art. It's not necessarily the kind of work that you come in and you get it and you go. I hope that people kind of spend some time really trying to understand what's happening and what they're seeing and how they're seeing and hearing. The sound is a really important part as well. There's hypersonic speakers, very directional speakers, so that in fact you only hear certain parts of the soundtrack in relation to places within the room that we've sort of picked out. And we've tuned the room, all the acoustics that we produce are tuned to this particular space. So there are valleys and peaks of this low frequency that I don't know if it's coming through on this camera, but that you actually physically feel the sound. So this kind of architecture of sound, architecture of the visual, and real space kind of hopefully merge into one. The shape of this particular screen for the work at Tabachna was developed, partially because of the size and shape of the room and sort of technical details, but it also forces viewers to assume one particular spot for the illusion to be the strongest. And so what we tried to do with this piece, it's an experiment to force kind of a longer perspective so that you see the borders of the screen are actually, when you stand in the middle, are actually become vanishing points in perspective. So this sort of classical, like the Renaissance painters that developed these vanishing points, and this illusion of space with a painting is actually reinforced with this screen, and that's kind of why we made it. So there's a flat frame, just as you would be a painting, but then the Z depth of the screen is developed in such a way that it creates those vanishing points and forces you to see these kinds of lines. And then we distort the imagery that's projected on there to create actually a moving vanishing point, which is something that is very unique. I mean, there's been a lot of work that's done that deals with anamorphosis. That's kind of what this illusion is an anamorphic transformation. And this practice in art goes way back to, I think maybe, there's even theories that early cave paintings are using anamorphosis. So behind me is R+G+B. This is an earlier work from 2009, I believe. Was the first time I put this one together. And it's it's part of a series of works called Unlimited Colors that sort of explore human perception of color. It's something that I've been really fascinated with. It's this kind of old classic sort of Newtonian theory, as well as, as it transfers into this kind of digital age. So I'm interested in kind of looking at this, the sort of human subjectivity of color. And with R+G+B, what it is it's taking the digital formula of a color and just using the digital formula to recreate the colors. So behind me, leftmost color represents the value of red, the middle color is green, and then the right color is the value of blue. And adding those three numbers together gives you the color of the background. So it's just exposing this kind of digital formula of how color is represented through computers or any digital photograph. I mean, people are taking so many photographs with their cameras, with their phones, and they always think like this is a representation of reality. But one of the things that I'm interested in is this transference of the analog sort of real world into this kind of digitized world. And there's a very discrete number of steps, as you can see behind me, that represent that, and those are all the colors that the average computer represents on a screen. So in fact, you're seeing a quantized, digitized image rather than a real kind of representation of reality. And I guess my point between all of this is this idea of when sort of red becomes orange, when green becomes blue, or green becomes yellow, like where are those steps? I mean, I can be, everybody looks at this work and they, can say, oh, it's green. But, so often with many people I have this argument like, no, it's green, it's blue. And I think in Russian there's even two words for blue. So there's a differentiation. The names of colors are very sort of culturally specific as well as very subjective, the way that we experience the world. And this work kind of takes it and digitizes it, rather than I say, oh, it's sky blue or it's grass green. I mean, what does that really mean? There's a famous quote that I always like to use when talking about this work of Joseph Albers, and maybe it's part of the inspiration of this work, where he said, I can stand in front of a room of people and ask everybody to imagine the color red, and I can be sure that everybody will imagine red, but I can also be sure that everybody imagines a different red. And that's kind of this point of this work. But here, rather than showing the subjective kind of differentiations of personal perception of color, it goes the other direction and is very discrete, sort of quantized versions of every color that the computer can represent. It's a generative piece. It's written purely in software, so it's never the same twice, and it's there is no looping point. I mean, I could probably try to calculate what the loop would be, but it would be years long if it ever repeated. But you'd have to leave the computer running that long as well. So this kind of thing is important to me as well, to have these things that continue to run. So this is Subtracting Color. This is not a generative piece. This is the only video loop in the exhibition here, Saturation. And I selected this work again out of this Unlimited Color series because I thought it was a nice play on words with the R+G+B. And here is the subtractive color process, whereas the RGB is an additive color process. So the more color you add, the closer you get to white. Here, the more color I add, it gets closer to black. So there's a bit of a paradox in the way that this piece works. And it's a very, simple piece. I was in my studio, I have a light table, and then I run through the standard set of Roscoe theatrical gels. It's a very kind of standard. Anybody that works in theater probably recognizes these. And I also show the name of the color as well as its sort of scientific quantified transmission of the light that's within that. However, I go through I keep adding these gels, as you can see, until I personally perceive there is no light coming through these gels. So it's black, ostensibly. Now, whether it's really black or not black, that again is the point, is the subjective idea of what is black. And I take a different path to getting there. So not only do you see things being added, and it's called subtracting color, it's actually subtracting light, I guess is maybe a more accurate description of it. But you also see then the names that Roscoe decided to give these gels, like pale bastard amber, or, you know, I don't know, there's, you know, pinkish rose, and, you know, again, this kind of like silly names. But they also, of course, have a number, and this is much more precise. You know, when you order these gels, that's usually what you say is, give me 402, not pale bastard yellow or something like that. So again, this is just a meditation on the names of colors, as well as the subtractive process of filtering light to produce color. Because of course, it's only, as you see these colors coming through the filters, it's only a particular wavelength that is being passed. It's not a reflective sort of color, which is mostly like when you see green grass, again, for instance, it's absorbing all the other frequencies besides green, and green is reflected back to us. Here, the filter filters every wavelength except for the wavelength that we perceive as green, that is like grass. Now, what Roscoe decides to call it is anybody's guess. You'll see it eventually.